You are standing at the edge of the northern world, where the land thins into forests, bogs, frozen rivers, and long stretches of quiet. The sky feels larger here. Sound travels differently. Even footsteps seem to sink into the ground rather than echo. This is the world that frightened the Vikings, not because it was violent or loud, but because it refused to behave the way the Viking world understood. The Vikings were not easily frightened people. They crossed open seas in wooden ships, settled islands that barely appeared on maps, and fought wars far from home. They raided, traded, farmed, argued in assemblies, and sang about their own deaths. Fear, for them, usually came with a name and a shape. An enemy could be seen, counted, and challenged. But far to the north and east of Scandinavia lived a people who did not fit into these rules. Norse sources called them the Finnar, a word that did not mean modern Finns alone, but a range of hunting and herding peoples. Today they are often identified as the Sami, though that word itself covers many communities spread across what is now northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. The Vikings did not fear them because they were powerful armies. They feared them because they lived differently, fought differently, and survived in ways that seemed unnatural to outsiders. If you were a Viking farmer or trader traveling north, you would notice the change gradually. The fields would thin, permanent villages would become rare, houses would no longer anchor families to one place. Instead, you would see tents, light shelters, sled tracks in snow, and paths that seemed to disappear on purpose. The Sami world was mobile. Families moved with the seasons, following animals, fishing waters, and grazing land. This alone unsettled the Viking mindset. Norse society was built around farms, land ownership, and visible boundaries. A person was defined by where they lived and who their neighbors were. The Sami did not define themselves that way. They belonged to regions, routes, and cycles, rather than fixed plots of land. To a Viking observer, this looked like chaos, or even deceit. How could you raid or conquer people who were not there when you arrived, and who returned after you left? But it went deeper than that. The Vikings believed strongly in visible strength. Weapons mattered. Ships mattered. Shields, armor, and numbers mattered. Honor was public. Power announced itself. Even magic, which the Norse absolutely believed in, followed known patterns through runes, charms, and practiced rituals. The Sami practiced a form of spiritual life that the Norse did not understand and deeply feared. Sami shamans, often called Noadi, used drums, chants, and trance states to communicate with spirits. These drums were not musical instruments in the Viking sense. They were tools for navigating unseen worlds. To a Viking, the idea that someone could travel beyond the physical world and return with knowledge or influence was unsettling. Norse sagas speak of Finnar, who could raise storms, cause illness, or strike enemies from a distance without ever appearing. Whether or not these powers were real is less important than the fact that Vikings believed they were real. Fear shapes behavior more reliably than truth. When Viking traders came into contact with Sami communities, they often treated them cautiously. Trade did occur. The Sami provided furs, especially valuable Arctic pelts, and in return received metal goods, cloth, and tools. But the tone of these interactions was rarely equal. Norse sources described the Finnar as dangerous, unpredictable, and best approached carefully. There are stories of Viking kings hiring Sami sorcerers to control weather before voyages. There are stories of Norse warriors refusing to pursue enemies into Sami territory, not because the land was unknown, but because it was believed to be protected. Imagine being a Viking raider, confident on open water and familiar coasts, suddenly faced with forests that never seemed to end, snow that erased tracks within hours, silence so complete it felt deliberate, and people who knew how to disappear into that silence. The Sami did not fight battles in open fields. They did not stand behind shields and shout insults. If they fought at all, they did so with ambush, distance, and patience. Bows, traps, poisoned arrows according to some accounts, and deep knowledge of terrain. This was warfare that offered no glory. To a Viking warrior, dying in battle was honorable. Being struck by an unseen arrow in a frozen forest was not. It was terrifying. Daily life among the Sami reinforced this sense of otherness. They survived winters that Norse farmers avoided. They hunted reindeer, elk, and seals. They fished through ice. They traveled by skis long before skis were used as sport. Movement across snow was normal to them. To the Vikings, snow was an obstacle. To the Sami, it was a road. Norse sagas and laws often placed the Finnar outside the normal moral world. They were not enemies in the usual sense. They were something else. A people who existed beside the Viking world, but did not fully enter it. Even marriage between Norse and Sami appears rarely, and is often described with discomfort or suspicion. A Viking man who married a Sami woman was sometimes said to gain strange powers or suffer strange fates. These stories reflect anxiety more than reality. They show how deeply unsettling the Sami way of life was, to people who valued structure, visibility and control. And yet the Vikings kept returning north. They wanted the furs. They wanted access to trade routes leading east. They wanted influence, but they never fully conquered Sami lands, not during the height of Viking power. Instead, borders remained fuzzy, control was indirect, fear lingered. As you listen to this story, you can imagine the quiet tension of those encounters. No great battle, no decisive victory, just generations of cautious contact, uneasy trade, and stories told around fires about people who could vanish into snow and speak with spirits. The Vikings, masters of the sea, found a land where the sea no longer mattered, and that raised a question they never fully answered. What do you do when strength, courage, and tradition no longer work the way you expect them to? As you remain in the quiet northern world, you begin to notice that the fear the Vikings felt was not sudden or dramatic. It grew slowly, over generations, shaped by repeated experiences that never quite fit into familiar patterns. Each encounter with the Sami added another layer to a sense that something here resisted control. The Vikings were excellent observers of human behavior. They paid attention to how people farmed, traveled, fought, and honored their dead. These details mattered because they revealed weakness or strength. Yet when Norse travelers observed Sami communities, the usual signals were missing. There were no large farms to burn, no stored grain to seize, no central halls to dominate. Instead, there was movement. Camps that shifted with the seasons, food sources that came from many directions rather than one harvest. Knowledge passed quietly through families, rather than proclaimed in assemblies. This created a problem for Viking strategy. Power in the Norse world relied on predictability. You could threaten a harvest, you could blockade a harbor, you could demand tribute from a settlement that depended on its fields and livestock. The Sami did not depend on any single place long enough for threats to work. If a Viking leader attempted to demand tribute by force, the result was often disappointing. Sami families could simply withdraw deeper into forests and tundra. Their wealth walked with them in the form of reindeer, tools, and skills. When Vikings arrived expecting submission, they often found emptiness. This absence felt intentional, almost mocking. Over time, Norse stories turned this practical difficulty into something supernatural. It was easier to believe the land itself rejected outsiders than to admit that traditional power failed here. The forests were said to confuse travelers. The mountains were said to hide paths. The people were said to know when strangers were coming long before they arrived. These beliefs were reinforced by real experiences. Sami hunters could read signs the Vikings overlooked: bent grass, disturbed snow, changes in animal behavior. They could move silently where Norse boots crunched and slid. They could wait for weather that grounded ships and slowed pursuit. For the Vikings, whose confidence came from action and visibility, this patience was deeply unsettling. The spiritual divide made things worse. Norse religion included gods who demanded courage and decisive action. Odin valued wisdom, but also sacrifice. Thor valued strength and confrontation. Even Loki caused chaos openly. Sami's spiritual practice did not announce itself in the same way. Rituals were often private. The drum was played softly, sometimes alone. Trance journeys were internal experiences. Power was subtle and indirect. When Vikings witnessed or heard about these practices, they often misunderstood them. They interpreted restraint as secrecy and secrecy as danger. A power that did not reveal itself was assumed to be more dangerous than one that did. This fear shaped law and custom. Norse legal texts sometimes warned against consulting Finnar for magic. Such warnings suggest that people were doing it anyway. Even those who feared Sami power wanted to use it. This contradiction reveals something important. The Vikings did not simply fear the Sami. They respected their abilities while fearing their independence. Trade continued under this tension. Sami hunters supplied furs that fueled Viking trade networks reaching far south. These furs were valuable, not only economically, but symbolically. Wearing them showed access to distant lands and rare resources. Yet trade never fully erased mistrust. Encounters were cautious. Agreements were limited. Violence remained possible, but unpredictable. Daily life reinforced the gap. Sami children learned survival skills early. They learned to travel long distances, endure cold and read landscapes. Their education was practical and continuous. Viking children learned farm work, weapon use, and law. Their world was structured around seasons of planting and harvest, assemblies and feasts. Neither way of life was superior, but they were incompatible in ways that made coexistence uneasy. When Norse expansion slowed in the north, it was not because Vikings were defeated in battle. It was because the effort was not worth the cost. Too much uncertainty, too little reward. Fear played a role here, but so did exhaustion. The land demanded adaptation rather than domination. Over generations, stories hardened into legend. Sami people became figures of mystery in Norse imagination, capable of calling winds, capable of cursing enemies, capable of seeing beyond the visible world. These legends served a purpose. They explained failure without admitting weakness. They allowed Vikings to believe they had encountered something beyond human rules. From the Sami perspective, life continued much as it always had. Seasonal movement, careful use of resources, quiet spiritual practice, limited interaction with outsiders. They did not set out to terrify the Vikings. They simply lived in a way that did not yield to conquest. As you listen to this part of the story, you can sense the slow shift taking place. Fear turning into boundary, boundary turning into tradition. A region marked not by walls, but by caution. The Vikings learned where their strength faded. They learned where silence mattered more than swords. But fear rarely disappears. It waits. What happened when new powers arrived in the north, and the old balance was challenged again? You are now moving forward in time, past the height of Viking expansion, into a quieter period where fear no longer came from sudden raids but from slow change. The long tension between the Viking world and the Sami did not end with a single decision or treaty. It faded unevenly, shaped by new powers, new borders, and new ways of thinking that neither side fully controlled. By the late Viking Age, Scandinavia itself was changing. Kings were consolidating power, Christianity was spreading. Written law replaced some oral tradition. Authority became centralized in ways earlier Viking society had resisted. These changes altered how the Norse world viewed difference and independence. The Sami did not disappear during this transition. They remained in the north, continuing seasonal movement, reindeer herding, hunting and fishing. What changed was the way outsiders approached them. Instead of warriors and raiders, the new arrivals were tax collectors, missionaries, and administrators. Fear did not vanish. It transformed into something colder and more bureaucratic. The old Viking fear of unseen power gave way to a new fear of losing control through neglect. Northern rulers began to view Sami lands not as dangerous mysteries but as resources left unused. Forests became timber, rivers became borders, people became subjects. This shift was gradual and often inconsistent. For a long time, Sami communities existed in overlapping legal systems. They paid tribute to multiple kingdoms or none at all. Their mobility allowed them to adapt to changing demands. But the world was closing in. Christian missionaries struggled in the north. Sami spiritual practices did not confront Christianity directly. They simply continued alongside it. This frustrated missionaries more than open resistance would have. Conversion requires attention and participation. Quiet persistence undermines authority without challenging it. As Christianity gained influence, Old Norse fears were reinterpreted. What had once been viewed as dangerous magic became labeled as pagan superstition. The Sami were no longer terrifying because they were powerful. They were terrifying because they refused to fit neatly into new moral categories. Efforts to suppress Sami religious practices intensified in later centuries. Drums were confiscated and destroyed. Rituals were discouraged or punished. But even then, change was incomplete. Spiritual life adapted. Practices moved indoors. Knowledge was passed quietly. Fear lingered, now mixed with misunderstanding. From a distance, history sometimes suggests that Viking fear of the Sami was irrational, that it came from superstition rather than reality. But when you look closer, you see something more complex. The Vikings feared a people they could not conquer, because conquest required control over land, food, and movement. The Sami denied all three by living lightly on the landscape. They were not powerful in the Viking sense. They were resilient. Resilience does not announce itself. It does not march or raid. It waits, adjusts, and survives. As centralized states expanded, resilience became less visible, but no less important. Sami communities continued to survive under pressure through adaptation. Some adopted new practices, some resisted quietly, some did both at once. The fear that once kept Vikings at a distance now faded into neglect. And neglect can be as dangerous as hostility. Borders hardened. Laws standardized. Education systems replaced oral tradition. Children were taught new languages. Old knowledge became something remembered privately rather than shared publicly. Yet survival continued. When modern historians examine Viking sources describing terror of the Finnar, they often focus on exaggeration. But fear leaves traces even when exaggerated. It shows where power hesitated. It shows where certainty broke down. The Sami did not defeat the Vikings in battle. They revealed the limits of Viking strength. That lesson matters beyond this story. Empires and cultures often measure power through expansion and control. They fear what cannot be measured or subdued. But history shows that endurance often belongs to those who do not seek domination. As you reflect on this story, you can imagine the quiet northern landscape once more. Snow falling, reindeer moving slowly across open ground, a drum sounding softly inside a shelter. No audience, no announcement. The Vikings passed through this world and left their stories behind. The Sami remained. Fear changed shape, power shifted hands, but survival endured. And that leaves a final question to carry with you. In a world that constantly rewards visibility and force, how many quiet ways of living have shaped history without ever demanding attention? You are now leaving the far north and moving into a different kind of silence, one shaped not by snow alone, but by failure of seasons. This story does not begin with a single disaster or a famous battle. It begins quietly, in fields that should have turned green but did not. In the early 17th century, much of Europe still lived by an old agreement with nature. Farmers planted in spring, harvested in late summer, and trusted that the rhythm would continue as it always had. Tools were simple, storage was limited. Most families survived year to year, not generation to generation. Then the seasons began to misbehave. This period is now known as part of what historians call the Little Ice Age, but the people living through it did not have a name for what was happening. They only knew that winters were lasting longer, summers were cooler, and the sun seemed weaker than before. You can imagine being a farmer in a mountain valley or a northern plain. You prepare the soil as you always have. You plant seeds at the proper time. You wait. The crops sprout slowly or not at all. When summer arrives, it brings rain instead of warmth. Grain rots in the ground. Hay does not dry. Livestock grows thin. And then winter returns early, erasing what little progress was made. This does not happen once. It happens again and again. For many communities, this slow failure was more terrifying than war. War had an enemy. Hunger did not. In places like Scandinavia, the Alps, the British Isles, and parts of Central Europe, records show repeated crop failures across decades. Not a single catastrophic year, but a grinding sequence of bad years that never quite allowed recovery. What makes this story unusual is not that people suffered. Many did not survive. What makes it remarkable is that some communities did. These were not heroic figures. They were ordinary farmers, shepherds, and laborers who stayed when logic suggested leaving. Migration did occur. People moved towards cities or warmer regions when they could, but not everyone could leave. Land ownership, debt, family obligation, and simple lack of resources kept many tied to places that no longer fed them easily. So they adapted. The changes were small at first. Fields were shifted to lower elevations where frost arrived later. Crops were diversified. Hardy grains like rye replaced wheat in some areas. Root vegetables gained importance because they could survive underground. Daily life grew narrower. Meals became simpler. Bread was stretched with bark, moss, or ground peas. Meat was saved for special occasions or emergencies. People learned to endure hunger without dying. This endurance required careful planning. Families rationed grain not by generosity but by calculation. How long until spring? How many mouths? How likely another bad harvest? These decisions were quiet and relentless. Communities also reorganized labor. Shared work became essential. If one family lost animals, others might help temporarily, not out of kindness alone, but because survival depended on cooperation. A village that collapsed into conflict would not last long. Church records from this period show fewer weddings and delayed baptisms. People postponed creating new households because resources could not support them. Life slowed. Weather itself became an object of attention. People recorded frost dates, snowfall, and wind patterns with increasing care. This knowledge was passed orally and sometimes written down. Farmers became amateur climatologists out of necessity. There were attempts to explain the changes. Some blamed divine punishment. Others blamed distant volcanic eruptions, though they did not know the term. Many simply accepted that the world had changed. What mattered was not explanation, but response. In mountainous regions, terraced farming expanded to manage limited warmth. In northern areas, fishing became more important as agriculture failed. Rivers and lakes provided protein when fields could not. Even clothing changed. Wool production increased. Layering became standard. Survival depended on retaining heat, conserving calories, and reducing waste. This was not a century of dramatic events. It was a century of small adjustments repeated every day. You can imagine waking before dawn in a house that never quite warms. You eat the same simple meal as yesterday. You walk fields you know may not reward your effort, and you do it anyway. The resilience here was not inspirational in the modern sense. It was stubborn, practical, quiet. Many communities did not survive this period. Entire villages were abandoned. Graveyards expanded. Records end abruptly in some places. But where survival occurred, it reshaped culture. Caution became a virtue. Excess became suspect. Planning for scarcity became normal, even in better years. By the time climate conditions slowly improved, the people who remained had been changed by generations of restraint. As you rest with this part of the story, consider how slow disaster differs from sudden catastrophe, how adaptation becomes invisible when it works. As the decades passed, the farmers who remained in these cold regions began to understand that they were no longer living through a temporary crisis. The failure of summer was not an interruption. It was becoming a condition of life. This realization changed how people thought about time, risk, and hope. You can imagine how expectations shifted. In earlier generations, a bad year was followed by a good one. Memory included recovery. Now memory included only caution. Children grew up without ever seeing abundant harvests. For them, scarcity was normal. This had a profound effect on daily routines. Farmers stopped assuming that effort would be rewarded. Instead, effort became an obligation, regardless of outcome. Fields were worked not because they promised abundance, but because abandoning them meant surrender. Seed selection became more careful than ever before. Families saved seeds only from plants that survived cold and poor soil. Over time, this quiet selection produced hardier local crops. Yields remained low but reliability improved slightly. This process took generations and required patience. There were no manuals. Knowledge was carried in habit and repetition. Which patch of land thawed first? Which slope held warmth a little longer? Which seeds failed less often? Livestock management also changed. Animals were kept smaller and leaner. Feeding an animal through winter required calculation. If it consumed more food than it provided in labor or milk, it could not be kept. Slaughter decisions were made early, before desperation forced waste. This meant fewer animals overall, but better survival rates for both humans and livestock. Homes changed too. Houses were insulated more heavily. Windows became smaller. Smoke was tolerated indoors because heat mattered more than comfort. Living spaces shrank to reduce warmth loss. Families slept closer together. These changes were not dramatic innovations. They were refinements repeated thousands of times across regions. Social behavior adapted as well. Communities learned that conflict was dangerous. Disputes over land or resources threatened survival. Local courts emphasized mediation rather than punishment. Feuds faded, not because people became kinder, but because they became cautious. Marriage patterns continued to shift. Young people delayed marriage until resources allowed. Some never married at all. Households grew multi-generational out of necessity. Elders remained valuable because they remembered past failures and small successes. Memory became a resource. Religion remained important, but its tone shifted. Sermons focused less on prosperity and more on endurance. Suffering was framed as something to be managed rather than escaped. Faith became practical. Festivals grew quieter. Celebrations were shorter and simpler. Excess was frowned upon. Saving became a moral duty. In some regions, communal storage systems developed. Grain stores were guarded and rationed collectively. This reduced individual hoarding and allowed villages to survive uneven harvests. Trust was essential. Once broken, it was hard to restore. Trust was easier to maintain in small communities where everyone knew everyone else. Records from monasteries and local councils during this period show repeated requests for tax relief. Governments responded inconsistently. Some reduced demands, others did not. Where pressure remained high, communities collapsed faster. This uneven response created patterns of survival that historians still study. Regions with flexible authority fared better. Regions that demanded the same output despite changing conditions lost population. The farmers themselves rarely recorded their thoughts. Literacy was limited, but their actions speak clearly. They stayed, they adjusted, they endured. This endurance came at a cost. Chronic hunger weakened bodies. Disease spread more easily. Lifespans shortened in some areas, but total collapse was avoided in pockets across Europe. What is striking is how little drama accompanied this survival. There were no speeches, no declarations of resilience, just routines that continued despite discouragement. You can imagine a farmer waking each day knowing that success was unlikely and still preparing the fields. That mindset shaped generations. When warmer summers slowly returned in the late 18th century, people did not immediately trust them. Old habits remained, storage continued, caution persisted. Abundance, when it came, felt temporary. As you settle into this part of the story, notice how survival changed values quietly and permanently, not through victory, but through repetition. This leads naturally to the final question of the story. When conditions finally improved, how did generations shaped by scarcity respond to a world that seemed to offer more than they expected? You are now arriving at the far end of this long cold period, where survival itself has already reshaped people more deeply than any single disaster ever could. By this point, the farmers who remain are no longer waiting for the world to return to what it once was. They have accepted that uncertainty as permanent. Generations have grown up, knowing nothing else. Children born during the cold decades learn early that food is never guaranteed. They learn which plants survive poor sunlight. They learn how to judge the weight of snow on roofs, how to store grain against damp, how to slaughter animals at exactly the right moment so nothing is wasted. These lessons are not written in books. They are learned by watching, repeating, and remembering mistakes. Memory becomes a survival tool. In many regions, farming calendars are rewritten without ever being formally recorded. Planting dates shift later. Harvest expectations shrink. People stop hoping for abundance and begin planning for adequacy. Enough becomes success. This change affects social life in subtle ways. Feasts grow smaller and rarer. Public celebrations do not disappear, but they become quieter. Weddings are practical rather than extravagant. Funerals become frequent enough that ceremony shortens. Life continues, but with restraint. You can see this shift even in architecture. Houses become more insulated, windows smaller, storage spaces larger. Communities invest time not in expansion, but in protection. Protecting food, protecting warmth, protecting people who can still work. Local knowledge becomes more valuable than outside authority. A farmer who remembers a winter from 40 years ago may carry more influence than a distant official. Experience outweighs theory. In some regions, this creates tension with emerging centralized states. Governments want predictable taxes and production. Farmers can no longer promise either. Records show increasing conflict over unpaid obligations, delayed payments, and reduced yields. Yet, punishment often proves useless. You cannot extract grain that does not exist. This reality forces slow change even among rulers. Some taxes are reduced. Some demands postponed. Survival at the edges of the system teaches flexibility at the center. Religious belief also shifts. While faith remains important, it becomes quieter and more personal. People pray less for miracles and more for endurance. The idea of divine testing replaces expectations of divine rescue. The land itself shows signs of long stress. Forests are cut back further for fuel. Soil quality declines in overused fields. Recovery, when it comes, will be slow. And then, gradually, almost unnoticed at first, conditions begin to improve. Summers grow slightly warmer. Frost retreats by days rather than weeks. Crops still fail sometimes, but not as consistently. Livestock gains weight more easily. Rivers freeze later and thaw earlier. For the first time in generations, surplus appears. This moment is not greeted with celebration. It is met with suspicion. People who have lived through scarcity do not trust improvement. Grain is stored rather than spent. Herds are rebuilt slowly. Fields are expanded cautiously. No one forgets how quickly fortune can reverse. When recovery finally stabilizes, the culture that emerges is different from the one that existed before the cold decades. It is more conservative, more cautious, less inclined toward risk. This affects migration, innovation, and even conflict. Communities that endured long hardship are less eager to gamble on expansion or war. Stability becomes more valuable than ambition. Over time, historians looking back struggle to see this change clearly. There is no single event marking the end of the cold century, no treaty, no battle, just a slow easing. But the people who lived through it knew they had been shaped by something immense. They had learned how to survive without abundance. This knowledge does not disappear when conditions improve. It becomes tradition. Parents teach children not because danger is present, but because it might return. Caution is inherited. You can trace this influence centuries later in farming practices, food preservation methods, and cultural attitudes toward waste. Even in times of plenty, echoes of restraint remain. This is why these winter farmers matter. They did not change history through conquest or invention. They changed it by enduring long enough to pass knowledge forward. They proved that societies can adapt slowly, quietly, and without recognition. As you reflect on this story, consider how much of human history is shaped not by moments of triumph, but by long periods of restraint that leave no monuments. And that leads to a final question worth resting with. How many of the habits you live by today were formed by hardships you never personally experienced? You are entering a city that still functions, still trades, still prays, and still argues, even as one of its most basic human rituals begins to fail. This story is not about a sudden catastrophe. It is about accumulation. It is about what happens when ordinary systems quietly stop working, one by one, until a city no longer knows how to care for its dead. The city could be almost anywhere in Europe. But for this story, you are walking through a large medieval city in the late 14th century. Its streets are narrow. Houses lean toward one another. Upper floors hang out over the road, blocking sunlight and trapping smells. Waste flows in shallow channels. Animals move freely among people. Death is familiar here. Childhood mortality is high. Illness arrives often. Most families expect to bury several members over a lifetime. Burial is not unusual. It is routine. At least it used to be. Traditionally, burial took place in churchyards. The dead were placed close to holy ground, close to prayers, close to the living community. Space was limited but manageable when population growth was slow, and death followed predictable patterns. Then the city grew. Trade expanded. Walls enclosed more people than they were designed to hold. Migration from countryside to city increased. Houses were subdivided. Families lived closer together. Disease spread faster. Burials increased, but churchyards did not. At first, the solution was simple. Graves were reused. Older remains were moved aside to make room for new bodies. Bones were placed in charnel houses, or stacked along church walls. This was not considered disrespectful. It was practical. The dead were expected to make room for one another. But then death began arriving faster than memory could manage. Plagues returned in waves. Not always the Great Plague that filled chronicles, but smaller outbreaks that killed steadily. Fevers, dysentery, respiratory illnesses. Hunger weakened bodies and made recovery rare. Clergy struggled to keep up with last rites. Grave diggers worked continuously. Earth was turned and turned again until it no longer settled properly. You can imagine walking past a churchyard where the ground looks uneven, soft in places, collapsing in others. In hot weather, smells escape. Despite best efforts, dogs dig, rain washes soil away. People notice. They complain. But no one has an alternative. The city government begins issuing ordinances about burial depth, burial timing, and cleanliness. These rules are written down and ignored when necessity demands. When there are too many bodies, rules become suggestions. Families begin to delay burials, hoping space will open. Bodies remain in houses longer than intended. Curtains are drawn, windows are closed. Neighbors know what is happening without being told. This changes daily life. Death moves closer to the living, not symbolically, but physically. In poorer districts, bodies are sometimes buried shallowly or at night without ceremony. Not out of disrespect, but because there is nowhere else to go. Churchyards fill beyond capacity. Some churches refuse additional burials altogether. The wealthy find solutions. Private chapels, vaults, payments for special plots. Inequality extends beyond life. The poor adapt differently. They share graves. They reuse family plots aggressively. They rely on memory rather than markers. Over time, the city begins to lose track. Records become incomplete. Names are repeated. Dates blur. A grave that once held a known person becomes anonymous. Bones are moved without documentation. The city does not stop functioning. Markets open, bells ring, weddings occur. But beneath this activity, the relationship between the living and the dead is changing. Burial used to provide closure, a moment when loss was acknowledged and contained. Now it feels provisional, temporary, unfinished. This affects belief. Some people worry that improper burial endangers the soul. Others worry about disease. Rumors spread that disturbed graves cause illness. Fear attaches itself to the ground itself. Medical knowledge is limited. People argue about causes. Is the smell dangerous, or merely unpleasant? Does proximity to the dead invite sickness, or is it inevitable? Authorities argue as well. Church leaders want to preserve tradition. Civic leaders want sanitation. Neither has enough power to solve the problem fully. New burial grounds are proposed outside the city walls. Residents resist. They fear property loss, stigma, and inconvenience. Transporting bodies farther requires time and labor many cannot spare, so the dead remain among the living. As years pass, children grow up accustomed to this reality. They play near churchyards that no longer feel sacred but crowded. They learn not to ask questions about uneven ground. Death becomes less ceremonial and more logistical. The city has not lost compassion. It has lost capacity. You can sense the strain in small details. Clergy rushing prayers, grave diggers exhausted, families accepting arrangements they would once have found unacceptable. No single decision caused this. No single moment marks the change. It is the result of growth without planning, crisis without recovery, and tradition stretched beyond its limits. The city still believes it honors its dead. It simply cannot do so in the way it once did. And this raises a troubling question that hangs quietly over the streets. What happens to a society when even death becomes something it can no longer manage properly? You are now deeper inside the city, where the problem you sensed earlier is no longer theoretical. It is physical, visible, and impossible to ignore. Death has begun to outpace memory, and the systems designed to manage it are failing quietly, one body at a time. In the early modern city, burial was not only a practical necessity, it was a social act. Funerals marked status, family continuity, and religious belonging. Graves were placed carefully. Names were recorded. Rituals mattered because they reassured the living that order still existed. But as population density increased, and waves of disease returned again and again, that order weakened. Plague outbreaks did not arrive as single events. They came in cycles, a few bad months, then a pause, then another return. Each time burial grounds filled faster. Coffins were stacked. Graves were reused sooner than intended. Bones were disturbed and reburied without ceremony. At first, authorities treated this as temporary. Extra pits were dug outside city walls. Emergency burial zones were established. The assumption was always that normal life would resume soon. It often did not. Over time, burial space became a constant concern, rather than an emergency one. Churches, which traditionally controlled burial grounds, found themselves overwhelmed. Churchyards became crowded landscapes of uneven ground, sunken graves, and exposed remains after heavy rain. For ordinary people, this changed how death felt. Funerals became shorter. Attendance dropped. Clergy moved quickly from one service to the next. The dead began to feel less like individuals, and more like a flow that needed managing. Inside homes, this pressure altered behavior. Families delayed reporting deaths to avoid fees or forced removal. Bodies were kept indoors longer than was healthy. In some cases, they were hidden entirely until nightfall. The city did not announce that it had forgotten how to bury its dead. It simply stopped doing it carefully. Medical understanding at the time was limited. Many believed that decay itself spread disease. The smell of death was feared almost as much as death itself. This created a cruel cycle. Crowded burial grounds were believed to worsen outbreaks. Yet outbreaks filled those same grounds faster. Urban authorities responded with regulation rather than reform. Burial times were restricted. Funeral processions were shortened. Certain areas were designated for the poor, others for those who could pay. Inequality followed death into the ground. The poor were buried quickly and shallowly, sometimes without markers, sometimes in shared graves that erased identity entirely. Wealthier citizens secured private plots or indoor burials beneath church floors, which created their own problems of decay and air quality. As space ran out, the city began to build over its dead. Markets expanded, houses were constructed on former graveyards, bones were moved, stacked, or ignored. Children played on ground that had once been sacred. Over time, memory faded. A street did not feel like a cemetery once the markers were gone. This forgetting was not deliberate. It was practical. People still mourned privately. They still remembered names. But public remembrance weakened. Death became something to manage rather than mark. Records from this period show growing anxiety. Complaints about smell, about illness, about disrespect. Yet solutions were slow. Moving burial grounds farther away required land, money, and agreement among authorities, who rarely cooperated efficiently. Some cities experimented with mass graves, located well outside populated areas. Bodies were transported at night to avoid panic. These measures worked temporarily, but reinforced emotional distance between the living and the dead. When burial becomes invisible, grief changes shape. The city continued functioning. Trade resumed. Children were born. Daily routines persisted. But underneath, something had shifted. The boundary between life and death had thinned. People began to fear dying not only because of pain or loss, but because of disappearance. To die was to risk becoming unmarked, unremembered, absorbed into the anonymous mass beneath the streets. This fear appears in wills and letters, requests for specific burial locations, for markers that could not be removed easily, for prayers repeated long after death. As you rest with this part of the story, you can sense how infrastructure shapes emotion. When systems fail quietly, culture adapts quietly too. And that leads toward the final movement of this story. What happens when a city is finally forced to confront the physical weight of all it has tried not to see? You are now at the end of the story, in a city that has lived too long with death close at hand. By this point, burial is no longer a private act of grief. It has become an administrative problem, a logistical failure, and finally a moral crisis. In the earlier sections, you saw how overcrowding, disease, and rigid traditions slowly overwhelmed the systems meant to handle the dead. Graves filled, churchyards overflowed. Temporary solutions became permanent habits. The living adjusted, as people often do, to conditions that would once have been unthinkable. But no city can ignore death forever without consequence. By the late stages of this crisis, the presence of the dead began to reshape daily life in subtle but persistent ways. The smell was the first sign. Contemporary accounts describe warm days when entire neighborhoods were filled with a heavy, sweet odor that could not be escaped by closing windows. People burned herbs and resin indoors. Some believed the air itself carried illness. They were not entirely wrong. Though germ theory was still centuries away, people observed patterns. Neighborhoods closest to overcrowded burial grounds suffered higher mortality. Children became ill more often. Fevers spread faster in summer. Fear returned, not as panic, but as a constant low pressure. Funerals changed. They became shorter, less ceremonial. Sometimes they took place at night to avoid crowds and heat. Coffins were reused or made thinner. In poorer districts, bodies were wrapped in cloth rather than buried in wood. Clergy struggled to maintain dignity in rituals that now felt rushed and incomplete. Prayers were spoken quickly, processions shortened. Bells rang so often that they lost their meaning. The city had not stopped caring about the dead. It had simply run out of space to care properly. Eventually, officials could no longer pretend this was a temporary problem. Records show increasing involvement of city councils, magistrates, and health boards. What had once been a religious responsibility slowly became a civic one. This transition was uncomfortable. Moving burial practices away from churches challenged centuries of belief. Many people believed burial in consecrated ground was essential for salvation. Proposals to relocate graves outside city walls were met with resistance, fear, and anger. Where would the dead go? Who would guard them? Would souls be lost? Yet necessity has a way of forcing change. In some cities, mass graves were opened beyond populated areas. In others, old burial grounds were cleared, bones stacked or relocated to charnel houses. Skulls and femurs were arranged along walls, sometimes labeled, sometimes anonymous. These spaces were meant to be practical. They became strangely symbolic. The dead were no longer hidden beneath the feet of the living. They were displayed, organized, and acknowledged. For many citizens, this was unsettling at first. But over time it normalized a new relationship with death. The dead were present, but no longer interfering with daily survival. Public health slowly improved. With fewer decomposing bodies inside city limits, air quality improved slightly, water sources became cleaner. Disease did not disappear, but it spread less aggressively. People noticed. Change rarely arrives as a single moment. It arrives as relief. Burial outside the city became standard practice. New cemeteries were planned with space, order, and distance in mind. Paths were laid out, records improved, graves became individual again. This marked an important shift in how cities understood themselves. The city was no longer a place that contained everything. Some functions, including death, were moved beyond its boundaries. This separation reflected a growing belief in management, planning, and prevention. Death was still inevitable, but it no longer had to dominate the landscape of the living. For ordinary people, life adjusted quietly. Children grew up without playing near open graves. Markets smelled less of decay. Churches regained their role as spiritual centers, rather than storage spaces for remains. Yet something was lost as well. When death moved away, it became easier to forget. The constant reminder of mortality that once shaped daily behavior faded, fear lessened, caution softened. Historians sometimes note that this distance from death changed how people understood life. Risk became easier to take. Growth became easier to justify. Cities expanded more confidently. The city that forgot how to bury its dead eventually remembered, but it remembered differently. Instead of ritual alone, it relied on systems. Instead of tradition, it relied on regulation. Instead of familiarity with death, it relied on distance. As you reflect on this story, you can sense how practical failure led to lasting transformation, not through revolution, but through accumulation of discomfort. The people who lived through this did not see themselves as part of a turning point. They were simply trying to survive crowded streets, recurring illness, and the quiet anxiety of living too close to decay. And yet their adjustments shaped modern urban life. The way cities manage space, health, and the dead still reflects lessons learned during these forgotten crises. You can now step back and imagine the city at rest. Clean streets, organized cemeteries beyond the walls, bells ringing less often. The dead are no longer everywhere. And that leaves one final thought to carry forward. When societies solve a problem by moving it out of sight, what do they gain, and what do they risk forgetting? You are standing on a road that looks like many others in early modern Europe. It is narrow, uneven, and lined with mud rather than stone. The countryside around it appears calm. Fields stretch outward, smoke rises from distant homes. Nothing about this place suggests that it is part of a war that will last for years. This is how many soldiers experienced war for the first time, not as a sudden explosion of violence, but as a slow departure from ordinary life, marked by confusion rather than clarity. The wars of the 17th and 18th centuries involved enormous numbers of ordinary men. They were recruited from farms, towns, and villages, where news traveled slowly and education was limited. Many could not read. Fewer still understood politics. Loyalty often meant obedience to a local lord rather than belief in a cause. When war came, it did not arrive with explanation. It arrived with orders. A man might be told to report to a gathering point. He would be issued clothing, often poorly fitted. He would be given a weapon that required practice he did not receive. He would be told where to march. Rarely was he told why. For many soldiers, the reason for the war was not just unclear, it was irrelevant to survival. You can imagine being one of these men. You leave behind fields that still need tending. You leave family members who rely on your labor. You do not know when you will return. You do not know what you will face. The road becomes your world. Early modern armies moved slowly. Supplies were unreliable. Soldiers often lived off the land, taking food from villages they passed through. This created resentment among civilians and discomfort among soldiers who understood that they were becoming a burden. Yet, there was little choice. Hunger was constant. The structure of armies reflected the societies that created them. Discipline existed, but it was uneven. Officers were often appointed through status rather than skill. Orders changed. Rotes shifted. Rumors spread faster than information. A soldier might hear that he was fighting for religion one week, and territory the next. He might hear nothing at all. Battles were not constant. Long periods of waiting filled most campaigns. Waiting for pay, waiting for supplies, waiting for orders that might never arrive. During these periods, boredom, and fear blended together. Soldiers filled time by repairing equipment, gambling, talking, and sometimes fighting among themselves. Disease spread more reliably than enemy attacks. Camps were crowded and sanitation was poor. Death was familiar, but rarely heroic. When battles did occur, they were confusing rather than glorious. Smoke from gunfire obscured vision. Commands were hard to hear. Training broke down under stress. A soldier might fire his weapon without knowing who he was firing at. He might retreat without knowing whether the retreat was ordered or simply contagious. Afterward, survival mattered more than victory. Many soldiers did not know whether their side had won a particular engagement. They only knew whether they were still alive. Letters home, when they existed, rarely explained the war. They described weather, hunger, illness, and longing. Causes and goals were absent. This ignorance was not accidental. Rulers and commanders did not believe ordinary soldiers needed understanding. Obedience was sufficient. In some cases, ignorance was useful. A soldier who did not know the political stakes could not question them. But this came at a cost. When motivation is unclear, discipline weakens. Desertion became common, especially when armies moved far from home. Soldiers slipped away at night, returning to villages that might not welcome them, but felt safer than the unknown road ahead. Some were captured and forced to serve the opposing side. Allegiance shifted easily when survival was the primary concern. From the perspective of those in power, this was frustrating. From the perspective of the soldier, it was logical. Identity during these wars was fragile. A man might fight under one banner without understanding its symbols. He might be told that the enemy was evil without ever seeing them clearly. When armies clashed, soldiers often discovered that their opponents looked much like themselves. Similar clothing, similar weapons, similar fear. This recognition did not always lead to compassion, but it added to confusion. Why were they fighting people who spoke familiar languages or shared similar customs? The answer, when it came at all, was distant and abstract. As you listen to this story, you can sense how war became something endured rather than embraced, a condition rather than a cause. The soldier became a moving part in a machine he did not understand. And this leads to an unresolved tension that defines the rest of the story. What happens to loyalty, courage, and memory when men fight and die without knowing what their lives were meant to achieve? You are now shifting from the battlefield itself to the lives behind the lines, the lives of ordinary soldiers who became the backbone of conflicts that stretched across kingdoms. These soldiers were not generals. They did not plan strategies or negotiate treaties. Yet they were essential to every outcome, and in many ways their experience was defined by uncertainty. In early modern Europe, armies were often composed of peasants, townsmen, and artisans conscripted or hired into service. For many, military life was a temporary reprieve from hunger, debt, or labor obligations. For others, it was a forced path imposed by local lords, kings, or colonial authorities. Regardless of reason, these men, and occasionally women, found themselves marching, drilling, and fighting in wars that were largely abstract to them. Consider a soldier in the 30 Years' War. His lord sends him to a distant province, across rivers and forests, with little explanation beyond a vague promise of reward or protection of faith. He is given a musket, a pike, or a sword, and a set of basic instructions: follow orders, march, and fight. Why this region matters, why these borders are contested, and why the king's alliances exist are largely irrelevant to his daily existence. Life on the march was grueling. Men traveled tens of kilometers a day, often carrying their own food, water, and equipment. Roads were rough, bridges were scarce, and weather was unpredictable. Rain turned roads into mud. Rivers became barriers. Snow and frost slowed progress and increased the risk of illness. Camps were temporary and unhygienic. Soldiers slept in tents, barns, or outdoors. Disease often killed more men than combat did. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox were constant threats. In some regions, the presence of an army brought famine to the surrounding countryside, which in turn worsened illness and mortality. Discipline was enforced strictly, often brutally. Desertion could lead to execution. Theft and insubordination were punished severely. Orders had to be followed without question, regardless of understanding. The chain of command was paramount. This obedience was sustained partly by camaraderie and partly by fear. Soldiers relied on one another for survival, but they also feared what awaited them if they failed to perform. Punishment was immediate, and retreat or hesitation could cost life not only to the individual but to comrades. Amidst this uncertainty, soldiers found small ways to impose order on their lives. Rituals, routines, and personal habits became crucial. A man might polish his musket each evening, mend his boots at dawn, or share a meal with a specific companion. These routines created a sense of agency in a world where most decisions were external. Letters from home, when they arrived, were treasured. They connected men to a world they could not influence but still belonged to. News from battles elsewhere was often slow, incomplete, and contradictory, leaving soldiers in a constant state of partial understanding. Combat itself was disorienting and terrifying. Battles were noisy, chaotic, and confusing. Soldiers often did not know the overall plan. They were told to hold a line, advance, or retreat, often without context. Officers may have had precise strategies, but these were invisible to those in the ranks. Individual acts of bravery or survival could feel meaningless in the broader sweep of a campaign. Wounded soldiers faced grim circumstances. Medical care was rudimentary. Amputations were common. Infection often followed even minor injuries. The risk of dying from a wound was high, and recovery was slow and painful. Hospitals, if they existed, were overcrowded and unsanitary. Despite this, soldiers adapted. They learned to anticipate the rhythms of war. They recognized signs of fatigue in comrades, the approach of enemy forces, and changes in terrain. Experience became a silent teacher, even when understanding the larger purpose remained elusive. This absence of comprehension created a strange psychological burden. Men fought without understanding the stakes, often following orders they could not evaluate. Some found comfort in religion, viewing battles as tests of faith or divine will. Others relied on superstition, believing in charms, rituals, or lucky objects to protect them from harm. The uncertainty of war shaped memory and storytelling. Veterans often recalled events in fragmented ways, emphasizing survival, comradeship, or moments of terror. The larger political or strategic significance was secondary. History, as recorded, filtered the experiences of ordinary soldiers through the lens of generals and chroniclers, often losing the human perspective in the process. And yet, the very anonymity of their service, fighting without understanding, allowed armies to function. Coordination did not require comprehension. Obedience replaced insight. Survival became both personal and collective. By the end of campaigns, these soldiers often returned to civilian life with scars, visible and invisible. Some received pensions or land, others none. Many carried memories of events they could not fully interpret, stories of hardship that faded from official records, but persisted in family narratives. As you consider this, you can see how the machinery of war relied not on heroism alone, but on quiet endurance, adaptation, and obedience. Soldiers were both instruments and witnesses, moving through chaos without full understanding. And yet the question remains, pressing and unanswerable. How does a life spent acting without comprehension shape a person? And how does it shape the course of history itself? You are now at the culmination of this quiet, relentless narrative, standing amidst the aftermath of wars that stretched across kingdoms, decades, and generations. By this point, the soldiers who endured without fully understanding the stakes have either returned home or been claimed by the conflict, their lives absorbed into the broader machinery of history. The campaigns of early modern Europe did not resolve neatly. Borders shifted, treaties were signed, and dynasties rose and fell. Yet the ordinary soldiers' contributions, often unnoticed in official accounts, were essential. Without their obedience, their labor, and their willingness to act without full comprehension, victories would have been impossible, and defeats potentially catastrophic. Many veterans returned home physically and emotionally scarred. Some bore amputations, chronic pain, or permanent disability. Others carried invisible wounds, memories of friends lost, orders obeyed that resulted in needless death, and the haunting sense that much of their suffering had been meaningless in the grand scheme. These were lives shaped not by choice but by circumstance, disciplined through repetition, survival, and endurance. Communities sometimes struggled to reintegrate these men. Returning soldiers often found that life at home had changed little, but they had changed profoundly. Family structures, local economies, and social norms remained intact, but the soldiers' perspective, hardened by repeated exposure to chaos and obedience, created subtle but lasting shifts in their interactions and expectations. In some cases, veterans became stabilizing forces in society. They brought skills in organization, logistics, and leadership, gained from navigating armies, marches, and campaigns. They also carried stories, fragmented, personal, and often incomprehensible to civilians of survival under uncertainty. These stories helped communities remember the human cost of war without always focusing on strategy or glory. Across Europe, the presence of these soldiers, veterans and current conscripts alike, shaped the social fabric. They contributed to the slow professionalization of armies. Armies became more structured, more disciplined, and more capable of complex maneuvers, precisely because ordinary soldiers had been trained to act reliably without understanding the grand design. In this sense, their obedience without comprehension became a hidden engine of historical change. At the same time, the psychological legacy persisted. Men who had fought repeatedly without clarity often exhibited caution, pragmatism, and resilience. They had learned to act under uncertainty, to calculate risks in the absence of full information, and to endure hardship day after day. These qualities, honed in war, quietly influenced their communities long after battles ended. Yet there remained a persistent tension. How much of life can be devoted to following orders without understanding, and what happens when such obedience becomes normalized? Societies depend on action, often without full insight. Individuals, too, navigate structures larger than themselves. The experiences of these soldiers serve as a stark illustration. Life can be defined by participation rather than comprehension. When historians study wars of this period, attention is often given to treaties, strategy, and the movements of kings. The ordinary soldiers, those who fought without knowing why, remain in the shadows. Yet their endurance, obedience, and adaptability created the conditions for both victory and survival, and their stories, when uncovered, reveal the hidden infrastructure of historical events. As the campaigns ended and Europe shifted toward relative peace in some regions, the soldiers' experiences settled into memory and myth. Monuments might commemorate generals or battles, but countless men returned quietly to their villages, carrying histories that would never be recorded officially. Their lives were a testament to the ways ordinary human endurance shapes outcomes larger than any one person could understand. In reflection, you can see that history is not only made by those who plan, decide, or conquer, it is made by those who act, obey, and endure without fully grasping the broader meaning. The lives of these soldiers illustrate the silent architecture beneath the dramatic narratives of kings and generals, and that leaves you with a lingering thought. How many of the events we consider decisive were actually built upon the countless decisions, sacrifices, and endurance of people who never knew their role in the larger design? You are entering a landscape where human life and the forest are inseparably intertwined. This is not a story of conquest or empire, nor of armies or kings. It is the story of a village whose survival depended entirely on understanding the quiet language of the woods that surrounded it. The village lies in a remote valley, cut off from major roads and distant from towns that might otherwise provide trade or protection. It exists in a rhythm dictated by trees, streams, animals, and the seasons. People here do not dominate the forest, they listen to it, and the forest in turn shapes their lives in ways both subtle and profound. To outsiders, life in such a village might seem monotonous or uneventful. There are no battles, no notable inventions, no dynastic intrigues. But what occurs here is extraordinary in its quiet consistency. People living with constant attention, learning patterns invisible to most, and translating them into survival. The village economy is based on a combination of small-scale farming, hunting, foraging, and woodworking. Fields are planted in limited clearings, yielding just enough grain or vegetables for families, with surplus sometimes traded. Livestock are kept small in number, primarily goats, sheep, and a few cows. Because the forest cannot sustain large herds, every resource is precious. Daily life revolves around understanding the forest, when to gather mushrooms, berries, or nuts, when birds migrate or hibernate, when game animals move from high ground to valleys. Every sound, scent, and footprint is observed and interpreted. Children learn these skills from the moment they can walk. A misstep or overlooked sign could mean hunger, or worse, injury. The forest provides both sustenance and danger. Wolves, bears, and wild boar move unseen. Rivers flood unpredictably. Certain plants are edible, others are poisonous. Villagers develop an almost imperceptible rhythm of attention. They know where to step, what to touch, and when to remain still. They develop a mental map that integrates geography, weather patterns, and animal behavior. But this relationship is not merely practical. It is cultural. The forest is treated as a living entity. Stories, rituals, and beliefs reinforce respect for its cycles. Certain areas are avoided at specific times to allow animals to reproduce. Dead trees are left standing because they harbor birds or insects that are crucial to ecological balance. Hunting is planned carefully. Overhunting would threaten the entire community's future. Communication within the village is influenced by the forest as well. Signs are subtle. A bent branch might indicate a path or danger. The patterns of fallen leaves can signal seasonal changes. Even the sounds of birds or the wind carry messages that outsiders would miss. Villagers develop an attentiveness that trains both body and mind to perceive what others ignore. Seasons structure every aspect of life. Spring is for planting and repairing shelters. Summer is for maintenance, collection, and teaching children the necessary skills. Autumn is harvest and preservation. Winter is for reflection, storytelling, and careful rationing of stored food. Each season flows into the next, uninterrupted by events of the wider world. Isolation reinforces these habits. Outsiders rarely visit, and when they do, they are often astonished by the villagers' awareness of subtle environmental cues. A traveler might miss signs of predators, fail to predict weather, or overlook edible plants that villagers can identify instantly. Such knowledge is the product of generations, passed down quietly and continuously. Survival here is not dramatic, but exacting. People cannot afford mistakes, because the consequences are immediate. One misjudged step, one misread signal, can cost food, health, or life. Yet this constant attention has shaped a community uniquely resilient to environmental uncertainty. The village also maintains its own quiet economy and social order. Elders guide decision-making, relying on their deep understanding of the forest. Conflicts are resolved through discussion and precedent rather than force. Cooperation is essential because no one survives alone. Every person's knowledge contributes to collective safety. In essence, the forest governs life. The villagers do not conquer it, but they harmonize with it. They live according to cycles, rhythms, and patterns that outsiders might call mundane, but which are extraordinary in their precision and consistency. In their attention, the villagers demonstrate a type of intelligence often overlooked by history, the intelligence of observation, patience, and quiet adaptation. And yet, for all their skill and care, one question hangs over the village. How do you preserve a way of life so finely tuned to nature, when the world beyond the forest moves ever faster, bringing new demands, technologies, and pressures that the old rhythms cannot anticipate? You continue to follow the villagers deeper into their lives, noticing how their survival depends not only on observation, but on constant adaptation. The forest is no passive backdrop, it is an active participant in the story, shaping decisions, traditions, and even the rhythm of daily life. Each year the villagers refine their knowledge, learning to anticipate subtle changes that outsiders cannot perceive. The villagers' understanding of wildlife is central to survival. They track the movements of deer, elk, and smaller mammals, noting where the animals feed, breed, and shelter. Hunters spend months memorizing signs, broken twigs, tracks obscured by wind, distant calls that indicate the approach of predators. This is not hunting for sport, it is carefully calibrated subsistence. Overhunting could devastate the community, so patience and restraint are paramount. Waterways dictate movement and settlement patterns. Streams and rivers provide fish, fresh water, and natural boundaries. Villagers note changes in currents, ice formation, and water levels. A sudden shift can signal flooding, freeze, or drought, all of which affect food stores and travel. Canoes and sleds are essential tools, and children learn early how to read the water, sense its temperament, and navigate it safely. Even plant life commands attention. Medicinal herbs, edible roots, and nuts are identified and catalogued by season. Some plants appear dangerous yet are valuable when processed correctly. Others are entirely off limits. Families keep oral records of when certain berries ripen or when mushrooms produce spores, transmitting knowledge across generations. Missing a harvest window could mean months of hunger. The forest also influences social structures. Authority is often based on environmental expertise rather than wealth or force. Elders, who have spent decades observing cycles of weather, wildlife, and vegetation, guide communal decisions. Their knowledge determines when to plant, when to hunt, and when to move livestock. Young villagers are apprenticed to elders, learning not only practical skills, but also the philosophy of coexistence with the land. Communication with neighboring villages is rare but significant. When trade occurs, it is tightly scheduled to avoid overburdening limited resources. Information is exchanged carefully. A rumor of scarcity or disease could destabilize a community reliant on delicate environmental balance. Travel outside the forest is undertaken only when necessary, and journeys are planned with meticulous attention to weather, terrain, and potential hazards. Conflict, when it arises, is often mediated without violence. Disputes over hunting grounds or water access are resolved through discussion and reference to past patterns rather than force. The villagers understand that disharmony threatens survival. Cooperation is embedded into their daily existence, reinforced by the tangible consequences of failing to work together. Spiritual life reflects this symbiosis. Rituals are often tied to environmental cycles. The first thaw, the autumn harvest, the migration of birds, offerings, songs, and small ceremonies acknowledge the unseen forces that shape life in the forest. Religion and ecology merge, emphasizing respect, observation, and restraint. Outsiders might see superstition. Villagers see practical wisdom encoded in tradition. The adaptation of material culture also illustrates their deep relationship with the environment. Houses are built from local timber, designed to withstand heavy snow and strong winds. Tools are carved or forged to suit specific tasks: hunting, woodworking, or food preservation. Clothing is layered and tailored to changing temperatures, and every object has multiple purposes. Waste is minimized because scarcity is constant, and careful use ensures long-term survival. Despite their skills, the villagers live with constant uncertainty. Predators appear unexpectedly. Storms destroy crops. Disease can sweep through livestock. Each challenge tests their knowledge and collective decision-making. Mistakes are costly, and learning is continuous. The village thrives not because it controls the forest, but because it listens, observes, and adapts with precision. This careful observation extends even to the unseen. Weather, wind direction, and cloud formations are monitored like signals. Seasonal shifts are tracked in minute detail. Villagers might predict a harsh winter months in advance based on subtle environmental cues, adjusting hunting, food storage, and livestock management accordingly. Survival is not passive. It is a daily exercise in anticipation and responsiveness. Yet, for all their care, the forest also imposes limits. Expansion is impossible beyond what the ecosystem can support. Modern pressures, taxes, trade demands, or the encroachment of outsiders threaten to upset the delicate balance. Every choice is measured against potential disruption, and even small mistakes have consequences. As you consider the intricate life of this village, it becomes clear that survival here is both mundane and extraordinary. It is built on observation, restraint, cooperation, and respect. It is a life that outsiders might dismiss as boring, but in reality, it is a quiet mastery over one of the most demanding environments humans have ever inhabited. And yet, one question remains. Waiting like the first snow of winter. How does a society survive unchanged when the wider world moves rapidly, bringing challenges and technologies that the old rhythms cannot anticipate? You are now witnessing the culmination of a way of life defined by patience, observation, and quiet adaptation. Over generations, the village has survived the unpredictable patterns of the forest, enduring winters that stretch too long, summers that barely warm the soil, and predators that challenge human presence. What stands out is not heroism in the dramatic sense, but the cumulative effect of thousands of small, careful decisions made by ordinary people. As the village continues through time, subtle changes from the outside world begin to intrude. Tax collectors, merchants, and eventually government officials appear, often misunderstanding the rhythm of life that has governed the community for centuries. New technologies, metal plows, firearms, and later, mechanized tools, offer the potential to expand agriculture or defend against predators, but they also carry hidden consequences. Misapplied innovations can disrupt the ecological balance, and outsiders' notions of progress sometimes clash with the delicate equilibrium the villagers have cultivated. The villagers respond cautiously. They experiment selectively, incorporating new tools only when they enhance survival without undermining established practices. Firearms, for example, are adopted for hunting large game, but overhunting is avoided through strict communal rules. Iron plows are used to cultivate marginal fields, but only after observing soil and water behavior over multiple seasons. Even knowledge introduced by outsiders, maps, written records, or scientific observations, is filtered through the lens of lived experience. Education becomes a combination of tradition and adaptation. Children continue to learn by observation, shadowing elders in the forest, while also gaining exposure to new ideas that could enhance survival. Storytelling remains central, not merely as entertainment, but as a way of encoding knowledge about subtle environmental patterns, seasonal shifts, and the consequences of past decisions. Every tale carries practical instruction as well as moral and ethical guidance. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the village faces challenges of a different kind. Expanding trade networks and population growth in surrounding regions create pressures on forest resources. Seasonal migration of animals becomes less predictable due to hunting and logging elsewhere. Climate patterns, though milder than during the Little Ice Age, still fluctuate, introducing occasional periods of scarcity. The villager's survival depends not only on knowledge, but on the ability to anticipate and buffer against these new uncertainties. The social structure adapts as well. Leadership remains tied to environmental expertise, but governance now includes negotiation with outsiders. Elders must balance the wisdom of the forest with the requirements of regional authorities. Trade is carefully managed to provide critical goods like metal, salt, or cloth, while minimizing dependence that could compromise autonomy. Cooperation remains vital. Communal decision-making is reinforced because mistakes are costly when resources are finite and environmental conditions unforgiving. What is remarkable is that, despite centuries of pressure, the village endures with its way of life largely intact. Survival has required flexibility, but also fidelity to fundamental principles: observation, patience, restraint, and respect for the natural world. Outsiders may consider the villagers' lives slow or boring, but their continuity demonstrates a type of intelligence and resilience often overlooked in historical narratives. By the early 20th century, modernization begins to accelerate. Roads, railways, and mechanized logging encroach on the forest. Some villagers move to cities, taking knowledge and traditions with them. Others remain, preserving techniques honed over centuries. The forest itself becomes a fragile partner, its rhythms still vital but increasingly influenced by human activity beyond the valley. Reflecting on this, you can see the enduring power of quiet observation. The villagers' lives reveal that survival is not always about conquest, rapid innovation, or dominance. It is often about listening, adapting, and understanding the subtle forces that shape the world around you. Their story demonstrates how ordinary people, through careful attention and small, consistent choices, can preserve a way of life against both nature and history. And so, as you imagine the village in the shadow of towering trees, with snow beginning to fall softly and the wind carrying whispers of ancient knowledge, one question lingers: how many other communities, forgotten by history, have survived in silence, shaping the world in ways no record ever captured? You are stepping into the heart of an empire, vast and seemingly unshakable, stretching across cities, rivers, and fertile plains. Its walls are thick, its armies disciplined, and its bureaucracies complex. And yet, within this sprawling dominion, the fragility of ordinary life, the very act of feeding people, becomes the thread on which everything hangs. This is the story of how a basic staple, bread, played a decisive role in the unraveling of imperial authority. Bread, as you will see, is more than food. It is a symbol of stability, a measure of government competence, and a source of social cohesion. When it fails, even the most powerful rulers cannot maintain order. The empire in question is the Roman Empire during the later centuries of its western dominion. Though its peak military conquests and administrative systems are famous, the everyday lives of its citizens often depended on the reliability of grain shipments, primarily wheat, from distant provinces. Cities like Rome, with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, could not rely on local agriculture alone. They needed constant, predictable deliveries from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Grain distribution was a logistical marvel, involving fleets of ships, ports, warehouses, and a bureaucracy that ensured that bread reached the tables of citizens and the urban poor. The state provided subsidies, annona, to guarantee that even the poorest could afford food. For centuries, this system sustained Rome's massive population, preventing famine and preserving social stability. But the system was precarious. Ships could be delayed by storms, pirates, or warfare. Harvests could fail due to drought or disease. Political disputes could interrupt administration, and corruption could divert supplies. Each of these factors was manageable on its own. Combined, they created the conditions for disaster. Imagine you are a Roman citizen in the city during the late 4th or early 5th century. Markets are crowded, smells of baked bread fill the air, and yet, over time, loaves become smaller, prices rise, and queues lengthen. Officials issue reassurances, but the flow of grain is erratic. Panic spreads not through swords or invaders, but through empty stomachs. Bread becomes both a lifeline and a litmus test of imperial competence. When shortages occur, unrest follows quickly. Riots break out. Citizens attack granaries, warehouses, and officials. Urban populations, accustomed to comfort and security, find themselves suddenly vulnerable. Soldiers are deployed not to conquer lands but to quell disturbances within city walls. The military, once a symbol of external strength, is redirected inward, weakening frontier defenses. Political leaders often underestimate the consequences. They assume that loyalty can be maintained through force or promises. Yet hunger is immediate and non-negotiable. When bread fails, trust collapses. Citizens begin to question the very legitimacy of rulers who cannot ensure basic sustenance. Meanwhile, the empire faces external pressures. Germanic tribes press against northern borders. Rival claimants challenge imperial authority. The coordination required to respond effectively is compromised, because resources are diverted to feed urban populations. Each delay in defense is magnified by the fragility of the logistical network. The symbolism of bread extends beyond survival. It represents the social contract, the implicit agreement that rulers will provide for the people in exchange for obedience, taxes, and loyalty. When that contract is broken, the social fabric frays, a single loaf missing from a table, can become a spark that ignites centuries of tension. Even in quieter periods without open revolt, chronic shortages shape daily life. Families ration bread. The poor skip meals. Malnutrition weakens populations, making them susceptible to disease. Productivity declines. Urban life slows. The empire's outward image of order is maintained, but beneath it, the structures are strained. Historians note that repeated episodes of bread shortages coincide with periods of political instability. Leaders who appear competent during good harvests are exposed as vulnerable during crises. Public confidence becomes as important as military strength. A city that cannot eat is a city that cannot obey. As you consider this, you can sense the irony. The vast machinery of an empire, its armies, roads, and monuments, can be undermined by something as seemingly mundane as grain. The complexity of politics and war is rendered fragile by a simple human need. And yet, for all the apparent simplicity, the question remains unresolved. How can a civilization so powerful, with armies at its command and resources across continents, fail because it cannot feed its people? You are now moving deeper into the consequences of the empire's reliance on bread, observing how the failure of this simple staple begins to unravel systems that once seemed unbreakable. The issue is no longer just scarcity. It becomes a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of governance, economy, and social cohesion. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire faced increasing difficulty in maintaining a steady supply of grain. North Africa, once a reliable breadbasket, suffered from overtaxation, soil depletion, and climate fluctuations. Egypt, another vital source, endured the pressures of bureaucratic corruption, shifting political alliances, and the occasional failure of the Nile's inundation. When shipments faltered, the consequences were immediate. Prices rose, and unrest began to simmer in the streets of Rome and other major cities. It is important to understand that the urban population depended almost entirely on imported grain. Unlike rural communities that could grow food locally, city dwellers relied on the state's logistical network. Any disruption was catastrophic, and repeated disruptions eroded trust in imperial authority. Citizens, once obedient, began to question whether rulers were capable of safeguarding the most basic human needs. Consider the mechanisms by which shortages affected daily life. Families queued for hours in crowded marketplaces, waiting for rationed portions. Those unable to obtain their share faced hunger or malnutrition. Children grew weaker. Laborers were less productive. Tensions within households escalated. Violence was not immediate, but the social pressure increased steadily, creating an environment ripe for revolt. Meanwhile, political leaders struggled to respond. Dispatching ships from distant provinces could take months. Procuring grain from alternative regions was complicated by competing claims and limited transportation. Corruption further reduced the effectiveness of any interventions. Officials often diverted shipments for personal gain or delayed delivery due to administrative inefficiency. The population could sense this inequity, deepening dissatisfaction. Urban unrest frequently escalated into riots. Granaries were stormed, merchants attacked, and officials threatened. The military was drawn away from frontier defense to manage civil disorder, weakening borders and creating openings for external threats. Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, aware of Rome's diverted attention, increased incursions. What began as a problem of bread rapidly became a strategic crisis with ripple effects across the empire. Religion and culture also intersected with this crisis. The populace interpreted food scarcity as a sign of divine displeasure, blaming both gods and rulers. Pagan temples offered rituals and sacrifices to restore abundance. Emerging Christian authorities promised divine intervention through prayer. Leaders attempted to harness religion to maintain loyalty, but the unpredictability of supply made reassurance difficult. Hunger is immediate and tangible. Religious explanation can provide comfort, but it cannot feed a stomach. Economic ramifications extended beyond immediate shortages. Grain scarcity drove up prices, destabilizing trade in other goods. Artisans, merchants, and laborers faced reduced demand. Inflation undermined confidence in currency. Taxes became more difficult to collect, creating a vicious cycle. The state needed revenue to purchase and transport grain, yet the population could no longer sustain taxation without food security. Military campaigns suffered as well. Soldiers on the frontier were paid in coin or provisions, but when grain shipments faltered, morale declined. Desertion increased, and units became less effective. Leaders faced the impossible choice of feeding the army or feeding the city, knowing that neglecting either could result in disaster. The empire's outward projection of power relied directly on its ability to sustain life internally. The empire's collapse in these regions was not immediate. It was a slow unraveling, marked by repeated shortages, uprisings, and the erosion of administrative authority. Each failure reinforced the next. Generations of citizens witnessed the state's inability to manage something as fundamental as sustenance, shaking faith in institutions that had seemed eternal. By observing this, you realize that the empire's downfall was not merely military or political. It was logistical, social, and moral. Bread, a humble staple, became a measure of competence, legitimacy, and survival. When the supply faltered, the empire could not maintain cohesion. Generals could command armies, yet rulers could not command obedience when hunger prevailed. And so the question emerges as you watch these events unfold. How could an empire with immense power, resources, and organization fail in the simplest measure of responsibility, providing food for its people? You are now observing the final stage of the empire's slow unraveling, where the failure of bread as a basic necessity becomes inseparable from the collapse of political, social, and military structures. What began as scarcity has now transformed into a systemic crisis, revealing the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations. By the early 5th century, repeated failures in grain supply had left cities tense and vulnerable. Riots were more frequent, sometimes erupting into widespread violence. Officials struggled to maintain authority, often resorting to temporary measures such as emergency shipments, price controls, or martial law. These interventions could only delay consequences. They did not address the root causes of scarcity. The weakening of central authority allowed local powers and external groups to exploit the situation. Governors, regional commanders, and even wealthy landowners sometimes diverted grain to secure loyalty from smaller populations, further aggravating shortages elsewhere. Germanic tribes, increasingly familiar with Rome's internal vulnerabilities, intensified raids along the borders. These incursions were no longer minor annoyances. They were strategic opportunities, exploiting the empire's diverted attention and depleted resources. Urban life deteriorated under constant pressure. Families faced chronic hunger, malnutrition, and disease. Labor productivity declined, trade slowed, and public works stalled. Citizens, once reliant on the emperor and his bureaucracy, began to seek alternatives: local protection, alliances with regional powers, or reliance on community networks. The social contract, symbolized by the state's provision of bread, had eroded. Trust in authority crumbled, as hunger revealed the limitations of imperial power. Even the military suffered the consequences. Soldiers, dependent on regular rations, faced shortages themselves. Desertion increased, recruitment became more difficult, and morale declined sharply. Units that had once been formidable now struggled to perform basic duties. The empire's ability to project power, once its defining feature, was severely compromised, not by external enemies alone, but by the simple failure to feed its population. In response, emperors attempted reforms, reorganizing grain supply chains, negotiating with provincial governors, and even engaging in diplomatic efforts to secure alternative sources. These efforts were often too little, too late. Bureaucratic inertia, corruption, and environmental challenges prevented meaningful change. Meanwhile, public dissatisfaction intensified, further weakening the emperor's legitimacy. Bread, the simplest of necessities, had become a measure of sovereignty itself. By the mid-5th century, the cumulative effect of these crises was undeniable. The Western Roman Empire, once considered indomitable, faced repeated sackings and invasions. Rome itself was entered by foreign forces, a symbolic moment marking the decline of centuries-old authority. The collapse was not a single dramatic event, but the result of decades of compounded failure to anticipate environmental variability, failure to administer logistics effectively, and failure to maintain the social trust that underpinned the empire. Reflecting on this, you see the power of everyday necessities in shaping history. Empires are not held together solely by armies, laws, or monumental architecture. They are held together by the ability to sustain life, to feed citizens, and to maintain the trust that comes from meeting basic human needs. When that trust fails, even the mightiest civilizations falter. And so, as you consider the fate of Rome, one thought lingers: the collapse of an empire can hinge not on conquest, strategy, or ambition, but on the humble loaf of bread, its supply, its consistency, and the people who depend on it. How many other great powers have been undone not by armies at their borders, but by the failure to meet the simple, constant needs of their people? You are entering a world of quiet intrigue, where power is formal and ritualized, yet the consequences of mistakes or of circumstance can linger long after life has ended. This is the story of a queen whose death did not bring closure, whose body became a symbol of political and religious tension, and whose story reveals the fragility of monarchy in a time of shifting authority. The queen in question is Margaret of Denmark, a figure who lived at the intersection of royal duty, dynastic expectation, and the personal vulnerabilities of rulers in the late Middle Ages. Her life, while outwardly privileged, was filled with the pressures of alliances, courtly intrigue, and the constant scrutiny of nobles and clergy. Queenship in this period was never merely ceremonial. It required diplomacy, management of estates, and careful attention to the succession, particularly in a world where male heirs were often prioritized. Margaret's marriage was arranged to solidify alliances between Denmark and neighboring kingdoms. Though outwardly a political union, the personal stakes were high. A queen who produced heirs ensured the continuity of dynasties and the stability of borders. Those who failed to bear children, or whose children did not survive, risked undermining both their own security and that of the realm. Margaret, like many queens of her era, understood that her body was inseparable from her political function. Beyond childbirth, Margaret's life was structured around courtly duties, hosting dignitaries, attending religious ceremonies, overseeing the management of lands, and mediating disputes among nobles. Every decision carried potential repercussions. A misstep could spark dissent, weaken alliances, or provide justification for rival factions to challenge the crown. Queens in this period navigated a landscape where the balance of power was delicate, and appearances were as consequential as deeds. Her death, however, brought an unexpected chapter. Margaret passed away during a period when both political instability and religious customs complicated funeral arrangements. Normally, a queen's burial would be a carefully orchestrated event: ceremonial procession, prayers, consecration of tombs, and memorialization to reinforce dynastic legitimacy. But in Margaret's case, the sequence was disrupted by a combination of environmental and political factors. First, her body was transported under conditions that would have been challenging in any era. Medieval, embalming techniques were limited, and preserving a royal corpse for extended ceremonies required careful preparation. Yet delays, whether caused by travel, illness in attendance, or political negotiation over burial site, meant that the queen's body remained in a form of limbo, awaiting interment in a setting that could satisfy both family expectations and religious requirements. Second, political factions within the court complicated matters. Rival nobles sought influence over funeral rites, attempting to assert their authority by dictating who could participate and which religious leaders would oversee ceremonies. The queen's body became an unintentional instrument in these disputes, symbolizing the balance of power even in death. Decisions over tomb location, procession route, and ceremonial rituals carried the weight of legitimacy. A mistake could signal weakness to rivals or even provide grounds for claims against the royal lineage. During this period, rumors and legend began to attach themselves to Margaret's corpse. Stories circulated about miraculous occurrences, ghostly visions, and divine disapproval. While much of this was likely exaggeration, it reflects the anxieties of a society where religious interpretation and political authority were intertwined. Even in death, Margaret's body was not just flesh and bone, it was a focal point for the hopes, fears, and rivalries of the living. Finally, the practical reality of medieval burial practices added complexity. Churches and royal chapels had limited capacity, and interments had to consider the placement of previous monarchs, family members, and other religious relics. Negotiations over tomb location were not merely ceremonial, they were expressions of hierarchy, prestige, and dynastic priority. In Margaret's case, these considerations led to multiple temporary interments, creating a situation where she was for a time buried twice before final placement. What makes this story remarkable is the convergence of the ordinary and extraordinary. The Queen's life and death were constrained by very human concerns, logistics, politics, and ritual, yet they also reveal the deep symbolic power of monarchy. Every movement of her body, every delay, every decision surrounding her interment, had implications far beyond what most people would consider in matters of burial. As you reflect on the circumstances, you can sense the tension, a life of privilege constrained by expectation, a death that unsettled the living, and a body that became both symbol and pawn. The seemingly mundane aspects of medieval administration, preparing a corpse, transporting it, selecting a tomb, carry weight that could shape alliances, influence succession, and assert authority in ways subtle and profound. And yet, one question hangs over the story like incense in a silent chapel. How does power persist after death? And what happens when even the rituals meant to cement authority are disrupted or delayed? You are now moving deeper into the complexities that surrounded Margaret's interment, where the rituals, politics, and human concerns intersected in ways both subtle and consequential. The story is no longer solely about a queen's death. It is about the tension between ceremonial expectation and practical reality, between the sacred and the political. After the initial preparations, Margaret's body was placed temporarily in a consecrated chamber within the palace, awaiting arrangements for permanent burial. This temporary interment was not unusual for royalty, especially in cases where transport to distant cathedrals or monasteries was required, but it introduced challenges that few outside the court fully appreciated. Corpses needed preservation, attendants had to remain vigilant, and the political implications of the body's placement could not be ignored. Court factions immediately recognized the opportunity to assert influence. Nobles who had been at odds during the Queen's life saw in her temporary resting place a chance to gain prestige or leverage. Debates arose over who would oversee the funeral rites, which clergy would have the honor of conducting prayers, and which heraldic displays would be permitted. In a time when appearances carried political weight, each decision was scrutinized as a statement of power. Meanwhile, logistical challenges compounded the political ones. Transporting the Queen's body to its final resting place required careful coordination. Roads were uneven, carts could fail, and weather was unpredictable. Attendants had to balance speed with dignity, ensuring that Margaret's remains were not only preserved but presented in a manner befitting her rank. Delays in travel, even minor, carried symbolic weight. A postponed funeral could be interpreted as disorganization or weakness, a reflection on both the royal family and the governing institutions. Religious considerations added another layer of complexity. The medieval church had strict protocols for royal burials, prayers, consecration of tombs, and the presence of relics or sacred objects. Margaret's body had to be treated in accordance with both spiritual law and political expectation. Clergy involved in the ceremonies were acutely aware that errors could invite scandal or even accusations of sacrilege. Religious authority, intertwined with political power, ensured that the Queen's death became a focal point for competing interests, each maneuvering to assert influence in both the earthly and spiritual realm. In addition to external pressures, internal court debates emerged over the physical treatment of the Queen's body. Embalming techniques of the period were limited, but increasingly sophisticated, and preserving the corpse for a prolonged ceremony required skilled attendants. Decisions about which preservatives to use, how to dress the body, and how to display it for public viewing were not merely technical, they were deeply symbolic. A misstep could offend both divine expectations and the sensibilities of the nobility. As preparations continued, rumors began to circulate among the populace and court alike. Stories of divine signs, ghostly apparitions, and omens were tied to the Queen's temporary resting place. While historians note that such tales were common in medieval Europe, they also reflect the anxieties of a society in which religion and politics were inseparable. Every delay or complication became an opportunity for interpretation, a chance to assign meaning to events that were, in practical terms, administrative. Over time, the accumulation of these factors led to the unusual circumstance that gave Margaret her enduring posthumous title. She was buried twice. The first burial, a temporary interment, was necessary to navigate logistical and political constraints. The second, Final burial allowed for the full ceremonial rites to be completed in accordance with both religious law and dynastic tradition. Each burial carried distinct significance, one practical, one symbolic. Together, they demonstrate how the life and death of a queen could be governed as much by protocol and perception as by personal or familial intent. The broader lesson of Margaret's story lies in the interplay of ordinary and extraordinary considerations. A queen's life was shaped by politics, ritual, and expectation, but her death, seemingly final, became a stage on which similar forces continued to play out. Even in stillness, even in a chamber awaiting interment, authority, loyalty, and influence remained active, shaping decisions, alliances, and reputations. As you consider the sequence of events, you notice a recurring tension: the desire for order versus the inevitability of delay, the sacred versus the political, the personal versus the public. These forces intertwine to create a situation both mundane and extraordinary, where a single death has implications far beyond the immediate moment. And so, a question arises, quiet but persistent: how much of history is shaped not by what people do in life, but by how their deaths are managed, interpreted, and remembered? You are now witnessing the conclusion of Margaret's unusual posthumous journey, where the practical realities of burial, the rituals of the church, and the machinations of the court converge in a narrative that is both solemn and revealing. The Queen's double interment is more than a curious footnote. It is a lens through which we can examine the intersection of power, tradition, and human attention to detail in a medieval monarchy. After the temporary burial, Margaret's remains were carefully prepared for their final resting place. Skilled attendants ensured that her body was preserved according to contemporary methods, wrapped and placed in ceremonial garments befitting her status. The journey to the cathedral or royal chapel was undertaken with precision, accounting for terrain, weather, and ceremonial protocol. Every step of the process was observed by officials and courtiers who understood that missteps could have consequences for their own positions. The final burial itself was an elaborate affair. Clergy conducted multiple prayers, rites, and blessings, each segment laden with symbolic significance. Nobles and members of the royal family participated, asserting their presence and demonstrating loyalty. The Queen's tomb was selected not only for its proximity to prior monarchs, but for its spiritual and dynastic resonance, reinforcing continuity and authority even in her absence. For those present, the ceremony was a display of order, piety, and power, a stark contrast to the confusion that had necessitated a prior temporary interment. Yet the story does not end with ceremonial completion. Margaret's double burial became a subject of chroniclers and historians, cited as a curious anomaly and a reflection of the delicate interplay between human planning and unforeseen complications. Some viewed it as a testament to meticulous attention to protocol. Others interpreted it as a sign of the challenges inherent in managing monarchy and ritual. In either interpretation, her posthumous journey underscores how even death could become a stage for politics, symbolism, and societal expectation. The Queen's legacy, preserved through tomb, record, and story, demonstrates the duality of permanence and fragility in medieval rulership. Life demanded performance, and death demanded careful management. The body, though inert, remained a tool of influence, and a symbol around which alliances, authority, and ritual coalesced. Every detail, from embalming to procession to final placement, was both practical and symbolic, a reminder that even in death, rulers shaped the perception of order and legitimacy. The broader significance of Margaret's story lies in how it illustrates the importance of meticulous attention in sustaining authority. Monarchies, particularly in the medieval period, relied as much on ceremony, precedent, and symbolism as on force or policy. Disruption of these practices, even through unavoidable logistical difficulties, had the potential to unsettle the court, the clergy, and the wider populace. In this sense, her double burial reflects a society acutely aware of appearances, perception, and the fragility of institutional power. Finally, you can see how history is often preserved in small details rather than monumental events. A queen's death, delayed and repeated in ceremonial observance, becomes a story that outlives its immediate participants. It teaches that stability, authority, and memory are as dependent on careful management of symbols as they are on the actions of the living. Margaret's double burial is a reminder that ordinary human practices, planning, ritual, attention to detail, can ripple across time, influencing perceptions, alliances, and historical record. And so, as you reflect on Margaret's story, one question remains in your mind: how many other events, seemingly mundane or procedural, have quietly shaped the course of history, influencing power and legacy in ways that few contemporaries could fully grasp.